So I started off as a scientist and 20 years ago, and I worked on satellite imagery of the ocean. And the image on the left is what I worked on. And at the time, it was the first time we were taking these. You guys have all seen hundreds of satellite images now, but at the time it was pretty new. And what this is not a picture, a satellite image of like clouds or desert, things that are really there, but this is actually a picture of photosynthesis. And so when I first saw this, I was amazed because it's not something real, it's a process. This is a picture of it's an actual image of a process. And what the process is the ocean breathing. But the breathing is the inverse of what we do. It's taking up carbon dioxide and giving off oxygen. And so I had, when I first saw this, sort of an emotional reaction, like, oh my gosh, like this is how complicated breathing in the ocean is. This is how hard it is to understand what's going on. And so that's why I worked on it for my Ph.D. I haven't looked at it for, 15 years probably, until I realized I was going to talk about climate change tonight. And I decided to find out where things are, like how much carbon dioxide is the ocean taking up, because that was the big question I was working on. This is back in the 90s. And the answer is just like you would expect. It's what science often does. There are two headlines that popped out when I tried to find out where things are with how much carbon dioxide the ocean is taking up today. One new study suggests oceans are losing the ability to absorb carbon dioxide. And then another one, headline, oceans may absorb more carbon dioxide. And this is what happens in science all the time. And so here are some articles I've written, and none of you have read any of them. They all have climate change in them. They're all completely about different things. One is about clouds, using clouds to predict climate change. The next one, Oceanus, that one's about corals and climate change. The National Geographic one is about climate change is what's called its ugly sister, this problem of ocean acidification. The bottom row, that's about these kind of rivers in the sky that can dump a bunch of water on California, and it's kind of like a hurricane system for California. And then the other thing is a website I've written called co2facts.org, which is about a solution to climate change, to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is carbon sequestration, which means taking carbon dioxide from smokestacks and injecting it back into the reservoirs where we first got the fossil fuels out. So I showed this slide to say science is totally complicated and hard, and it's all over the place. And I don't know if science writing, which is what I do, gets the message out. I'm pretty sure it doesn't. And also to say that climate change is kind of a background over this broad range of science right now. And it's almost like the way, this context for the way I think scientists and science writers are understanding the world. But I don't know if that's happening for people who don't pay attention to science writing. And so I struggled with this idea, and I actually got interested in this kind of adjacent question to climate change, which turns out to be a climate change story because almost every story is a climate change story right now. And when I was working on the ocean acidification story for National Geographic, there was a question of what organisms are going to do well in a future acidified ocean. And one of them that was suggested were jellyfish, because they don't have a shell, and acid dissolves shells. So I started looking into this, and I've been writing this book called Spineless about jellyfish. And it's not just about jellyfish, it's about me growing my own spine as a writer, and it's about our collective spinelessness at not sort of setting an intention for our planet. And the reason I've been writing this book is because it's not just science writing. I think it's art, in that I'm trying to make an emotional connection with my readers. And so that's, I think art will save the world. I think it's the only way to save the world, and the reason is because art connects with emotions in the way that nothing else can.
Well, I'll start with the punchline. I think there's no question that art can be part of the solution to the environmental challenges that we face. And I'm going to focus pretty specifically on water And I would challenge that none of us can do it alone. So it won't just be art, and it certainly won't just be the environmental sector. It definitely won't just be nonprofits, and government has already abdicated a big chunk of its role. So what we stay focused on at the Nature Conservancy is, how can we take we look at nature as an interconnected set of systems, right? So here we are in Texas. How do these systems fit together? Well, Texas is a great big land-based state. In fact, Texas has most of the ecosystems found on the planet. We've got forests, we've got grasslands, we've got deserts, we've got oceans, we've got freshwater systems. I often think that one of the reasons people that are from Texas are so comfortable wherever it is that they land on this planet is because you're comfortable in the environment. If you've seen Texas, you've seen a little bit of most of the world. Whatever happens on land when it rains is going to wash into our rivers and streams and aquifers. That's really, really important in Texas because over 95% of Texas is privately owned, so it's out of our hands. And whatever happens in the rivers and streams and aquifers in Texas is going to make its way into the Gulf of Mexico. That is an example of an interconnected system. And the thing about natural resources that we sometimes forget because they're so easy to access, water's really easy to access. All you have to do is turn on the tap, right? So it feels abundant for most people. Water's a really fixed asset on this planet. We don't have any more or less water on the planet today than we did 10,000 years ago. The only difference between then and now is the number of us and how we're using that natural resource. And Texas has become this really, really interesting crucible for how we're going to answer the question of water. And here's why. We are reflecting every major global trend that's happening right now. We're growing really quickly. The world's population is moving from 7 billion people to 9 billion people. We're moving from 25 million people to 50 million people. Within that, people are packing into cities like never before. People are not moving to dime blocks. They're moving to Austin and Houston and San Antonio and Fort Worth. They're moving into the big cities. So urbanization is a major global trend, which drives the need for concentrated natural resources like water, right? The third trend, of course, is that people are moving into coastal cities even faster than they're moving into any other kind of city. So we are moving ourselves into harm's way, meaning we are moving ourselves into environments that are experiencing more frequent and more intense storm damage than ever before. That's all happening in Texas. The same things that are happening around the world are happening in Texas. And we already know, and the drought has shown us. The drought has put a nice little exclamation point on that set of facts for us, because what the drought is showing us is you can run dry. I loved this art project. So I have to say I'm a native Austinite, and I've been running around the trail for a really, really long time. And it was so neat for me because I spend so much of my professional life talking about water and thinking about how we can strike a balance and how we need to use water for a growing state and a growing economy, but also how we can legitimately conserve water in our rivers and lakes and streams and aquifers. And that's not an independent sort of nice to have thing at the end of the day. Conserving that resource where it belongs that is our savings account. That's the only savings account we've got for water. And if we don't leave it in those places, it will not be available for others. And so I thought this was really just such an incredibly clever and poignant way of demonstrating what scarcity looks like. So for me, when I think about the environment, so, you're a group of people that relate to, I'm assuming, art first, maybe water second. I don't know where you are on the environment. But I will tell you this, the environmental movement, so to speak, is not experiencing an all-time high right now. We kind of went into a ditch after climate legislation died in Washington. And part of what we are all realizing, those of us that work in this space, is it can't even be a movement. The conditions are too constrained. We have got to find a way to compel people to care enough about natural resources so that they do it without having to belong to a movement. And what I love about the panel tonight, what I love about what you all are trying to accomplish is that means everybody's got to participate. That means we have to find people where they are. If these issues are more meaningful to you when we come at them from an artistic approach, let's do it. If it's more meaningful to you, if we tweet about, I got 140 characters for you. If we need to, write scientific articles, because those are important, because by the way, the science is the backbone of what it is that we're doing on the ground, then let's do that too. And I think, the message for me this evening, and it's always my message, is conservation has to be an all-in strategy. There's not an individual or a sector that can solve these problems on their own, but I am extraordinarily optimistic that we can solve them. There's no reason to believe, and there's no good, and I think people have been inoculated to the threat of what might happen if you don't ... I'm of the opinion, I like to put it the other way. What might happen if you ... What happens if we don't say that we're just hanging on by our fingernails trying to prevent more loss and more devastation? What if we set our minds to creating improvements and making things better? And there are really practical conservation strategies that are exercised by all sorts of organizations, including the one that I work for, that demonstrate that when we put our minds to it, we can leave things better than we found them. And so to the extent that art can help draw emotion and connection and activation on those fronts, I'm all about that. And I think this has been a tremendous, I just think it's been really neat for Austin, and I hope you put it right back in the water because I love seeing it.
Laura, I really love what you were saying about being able to leave things in a better condition. I'm with the Office of Sustainability, and sustainability is one of those concepts that can be rather nebulous. But even if we can come to a clear definition of that, I think it might leave us a little short. And one of a really well-known green architect, William McDonough, really doesn't like the word sustainability. He likes to think about regenerative design. And he says that if I was to ask you, how's your marriage? And you said, sustainable, he'd say, I'm sorry. Nevertheless, in my office, we do try to help people understand what the heck does sustainability mean, because it actually is a pretty common term in parlance today compared to 5-10 years ago when nobody really was hearing the word. So one of the things we are focusing on in our office is communication, education. How can we simplify the message, being a part of government and having many different silos within government. One of our problems is we send out about 500 different messages with different labels and terminology and logos, and it becomes a lot of noise. And so we're trying to streamline the message and lead people more quickly to the information that they might be looking for if they're trying to find out something from government. And so one of the things we're using is this branding. We use the terminology rethink because we think sustainability is not something we're ever going to actually just achieve and say, we're done, victory has been declared, it's the end. It's a process, and it's a continual process. We're going to have to continue rethinking and questioning and examining why we do what we do, how we're doing it, what we're trying to achieve. Are we in a position where we just got where we are by default? We didn't really necessarily plan to get to where we are right now in many respects. We use this framework with 10 different what we call action areas for sustainability, and we talk about how broad sustainability is in terms of it's not just about the things that you would expect to see within a framework like this with water, energy and climate, ecosystems, but it also includes arts and culture, it includes health, it includes education. Some folks think that in addition to the 3 components of the triple bottom line of sustainability, there should be a 4th leg, which would be culture. The 3 that we think of most traditionally as the triple bottom line are the environment, the economic component, and the more community and social component. I just call the arts a part of that. And somehow magically, if we were able to integrate the 3 parts of the triple bottom line, one of the ways I like to think about it is that if we were to pose the question or a problem needing a solution to 3 very wise people, and those people were Mother Teresa, John Muir, and Winston Churchill, what would be the answers that they would give us to that challenge? And they would probably each be extremely different, but if we could somehow integrate those 3 answers, we might be kind of reaching towards sustainability. So this rethink concept, we kind of have a plug-and-play set of words that we use. You can be rethinking water, energy, waste, mobility, health, all these different things. We have kind of a stable of words that we use. We're going to be coming out with a report soon on this action agenda framework. One of the things that I wanted to mention that we're focused on is the Sea Home redevelopment, and we're applying an eco-district framework. It's a framework that comes out of the Portland Sustainability Institute. We've been doing a lot of analysis recently on what the potential might be if we were to really maximize sustainable solutions in the neighborhood. So this is a very technical look at what might be possible. But one of the things we're very interested in with this project is kind of engage the community. Some people will be very interested in this kind of data, but who's ever seen a kilowatt or even a megawatt? A lot of these kinds of numbers, once again, lose people because a lot of the things we're talking about are very invisible, and we're trying to figure out ways to make things more tangible, and that's one of the things that I think is so powerful about art, about the Thirst Project, is that really being able to connect to something that's more visceral, that you can see that maybe will elicit an emotion. I'm not sure how much of an emotion a kilowatt elicits from people. So with that project, we've been coming up with some concepts for things we'd like to do. They're really in the twinkle stage at this point. But one of the ideas we've been talking about is how can we utilize art in the neighborhood to create very large-scale indicators of what's happening related to sustainability, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or how much rainwater we're collecting in the neighborhood. The example we've used that everybody relates to in Austin is the UT Tower. When it's lit up orange, pretty much everybody knows we won. Whatever it was, we won something. And so if we could use the stacks that are part of the historic power plant, and we'd have to project light on them because you can't touch them, they're historically protected. Could those be a very large set of indicators for sustainability? So just some concepts that we've been utilizing recently. Could we use them to communicate with residents about how we're doing on all the Imagine Austin key performance areas? Could we use them to communicate about, as I was saying, water, energy, other technical aspects of the neighborhood? Maybe we could use them to communicate about disasters or important weather information that people might be interested in. We've done some research on art installations in other parts of the world that interpret environmental information, in many cases using light. This is just an example of one of those. So we're kind of looking for some models. We've also been talking to the library, the new central library team that will be in that same neighborhood about what we might be able to do with some of the art installations they're pursuing. And then we're very interested in a feedback loop of this data. If we could communicate data to the community about what's happening, whether or not we're meeting goals that have been set, would we be able to create a feedback loop whereby somebody would see that and say, oh, we're really falling far short of our goal on transportation today. I really need to walk to that meeting. We've talked about using step counters with everybody in the neighborhood, and if we had a goal of 10,000 steps per day and you could see how well you were doing towards meeting the goal or not, it might have an impact on your behavior. So we're kind of playing around with some of these ideas right now. We're also in the process of creating a behavior change app that's going to be launched in April of this year. That connects to social networking and also gamification. You can earn badges with this app. One of the things we're interested in is how we connect to a more broad-based community, so we're not just preaching to the choir. We tend to put on a lot of events where folks come to hear the information, but they kind of already knew before they come there. So we're hoping through something like this app that would be a free download, we might be able to reach a much broader audience with some of our messages.
My uniform is a part of what I'm doing. It says, y'all see the polar bear? It says skeptics are tasty. Part of the challenge is what this new field of global warming psychology tells us that we need to be doing is something that different than what we've been doing before. They're telling us we need to use art to communicate science. And you'll probably realize that scientists and engineers like myself don't get to spend a whole lot of time in the art community. Well, that's changing, or at least us in the outreach community are trying to change that. Outreach, again, that's just the conveyance of knowledge from one point to another, from some place that has it to some place that doesn't. That's what my nonprofit does. This new science of global warming psychology is what I'm trying to communicate. All this new stuff about climate change that is having such a hard time getting out into the public. Americans' views are 20 years behind. You know, that's everybody. It's a long way behind. Actually, that's wrong. It's 25 years. 1991, 60% of climate scientists believed that Earth was warming. Today, 97% believe, but maybe 60 to 70% of Americans believe. We got trouble with climate science too, in that it's not that it disagrees with itself, this disagreement like with whether or not the oceans are going to absorb more or not carbon dioxide. It depends on what you're looking at. The oceans are kind of stable right now. We can't quite figure out why they're not absorbing less. And at the same time, it looks like they could absorb more, but they're stable. They've been stable for a long time, and they haven't really been predicted to be stable. So there's changes like that that are kind of hard to figure out, but there's a lot of them that aren't. And science is having a hard time keeping up with them. And a good example is this Antarctic ice Antarctica was not supposed to begin losing ice until sometimes after the 21st century ended. That was what they told us in the 2007 IPCC report. In the 2013 IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the big 2,000, 3,000 scientist thing. Just last October, their latest report says that Antarctica has now started losing ice and it's caught up with Greenland. So you've got this science that's behind, or there's something that's causing the scientist to communicate poorly. And that's what this new global warming psychology is all about, is trying to get the science out there. A lot of scientists knew that Antarctica has been losing ice for 15 years, maybe even 20 years. But because this consensus didn't agree with the leading edge scientists, which is real hard to get the consensus to agree with the guys that are out on the edge, that knowledge was not communicated. So it's an example of how it's difficult to communicate this rocket science stuff, because it is rocket science and it is hard to communicate. And it's not that the scientists don't agree about what the latest is. Well, I guess it is that they just don't agree, but it's not. It doesn't change the facts. It's a challenge with the scientists themselves and their egos and how they view things. And it's the fairness bias in the media. You know, we think of the media as trying to present things. You know, one side of the media, the conservative side, presents it differently than the liberal side. What's actually going on is that the media is biased, and they're biased towards one side or the other. And generally, it's not towards the liberal side. This image here is a picture of Padre Island National Seashore, and a place where we don't normally see beach erosion. And just this year, we've started to see the waves eating at the base of the dunes, meaning that basically we're crossing a threshold of sea level rise and we're starting to lose our beaches. One of the things that I've done with my nonprofit is to put on another climate forum, and we had Jim Spencer as our host, and we talked about climate communications from the media and how weather people are really important in the message too. And we've got to get our weather people more knowledgeable about climate change. It might seem like they are knowledgeable, but really the weather is a lot different from climate. Climate is average weather over long periods of time. Weather is what's going to happen in the next 3 to 5 days. This is my website, where I try to use a lot of images. And the top image there that looks like climate science art is climate science art. That's a pretty neat art form. Scientists these days are using more and more color, just like the global warming psychologists tell us we're supposed to do. This is my film website. My films are basically just documentaries of my trips to Greenland and all over the Rockies, looking at 64 million acres of dead pine trees, and down to the coast, watching the beaches erode. Hold the camera out here, tell people what's going on. I spend most of my time just taking pictures and showing pretty pictures. Music is another really interesting opportunity for climate outreach. This is my band. My films are somewhat experimental. They're more rockumentaries than they are documentaries. There's not a whole lot of talking heads, just mine every once in a while. And our music is just basic, good old Austin blues and rock and folk, talking about climate issues. See, am I done yet? Climate change t-shirts. It's getting climate in front of people, because most people, I used to ask people, I still do all the time in the line at the supermarket, everybody in front of me and back of me, what do you think, quick, when I say climate change? And they'll, 30-40% of them, even in Austin, would say, you mean like spring now instead of being winter? And there's a great presentation on our current drought. How many of y'all know that the 30-year average Austin rainfall has increased? Not decreased, increased. The 10-year average has increased even more than the 30-year. How many of y'all know that the rainfall in the watershed has increased, not decreased? Inflows to the lakes are much less, even though rainfall has increased in the watershed. The reason is evaporation. A little bit of heat creates a lot more evaporation. And so we're seeing a lot more evaporation. It's not coming from the lakes. It's coming from soils and from plants. That's why we're having this huge drought in our upper watershed, is evaporation. We're getting more rain, but it's a little bit warmer. We're getting rainfall events that are further apart. It's drier in between, creating more evaporation. I think that's all.
A lot of you have hopefully saw the thirst installation. This was the night that we illuminated it. Kirk Watson spoke. These were the crowds of people here to see when we lit it. This installation was a collaboration with Women in Their Work, Bailey Liu, who's a visual artist, the architects Norma Yancey and Emily Little, and Cassie Bergstrom, who's a landscape architect. And our thought was what we were actually challenged by the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation to come up with an idea that would have a huge impact on where you are. And Robert Rauschenberg believed and was on record saying that art could change the world. And we sat and thought, what is the issue most pressing to Austin? And we felt it was water. And from there, we thought, where should this piece be? And we thought it had to be on Lady Bird Lake, which, as you know, was called Town Lake for years. And it is kind of the emotional and spiritual center of Austin. It's also a constant level lake. So everyone, the tens of thousands of people that are down there week after week, would be down there thinking nothing has changed because the water is always the same, it's always green right around Lady Bird Lake. But this thirst was designed to challenge that complacency and to have people think, wait, things are different. If we saw Lake Travis every day, we couldn't get our breath. It is so startling to see. I think it went from 34 to 35% of capacity, but it is a parched moonscape, and that's our water source. But here in the heart of Austin, everything is looking mighty fine. We got all of these. One of the things that was really exciting about this particular project was all the response we had, and because of being in 2013 at the time, we could rely on Twitter and Instagram, and we had a website, and so people sent us images, pictures. These are all that they would put filters on it and screens and tweet and talk, and there was a lot of communication, and people actually from all over the world responded to this. Some of them, the timing was actually quite good in that it was the South by Southwest Eco Conference and ACL. So there were lots of people here from out of town that took images and took pictures of the installation. And also, it was a very poignant, I think it's very poignant, and there was actually quite a bit of resistance initially to having this be at Lady Bird Lake, because it is so central and there's a lot of protectiveness about that. Plus, nobody had really ever put a tree on a spike in the middle of the lake that weighed 2.5 tons. So there was a question about maybe putting it at some other place, but we really wanted to have it be here just to cause consternation and surprise, and people would come up upon it and want to know what is going on. Then we had not one, but 2 floods. And this sort of epitomized, I mean, at the time we thought we were either the prayer flag, we thought, well, we put up 14,000 prayer flags. So one of the thoughts was, well, maybe we should put up 12,000 because we had these deluges of rain. But of course, this was a sign of the climate disruption that we're facing. And also, this water really didn't benefited our lawns and our potted plants, but not the watershed, because it was too far, it wasn't in the right direction. But it brought home to us, because we also received calls all about, well, what about this? We solved it. You solved it. Congratulations. So people, it struck us how confusing and contradictory and complex the issue is, and how people, they see this and they think, well, things are much better, and in fact, they didn't change hardly at all. We had a number of outreach of education programs with kids and with other people trying to bring attention to this, because that's really the future, is can we reach people? Can we affect their response to what they're seeing? So we had a number of projects going around that. And then this was, we took this on the last night that it was up. It seems, we drew, Bailey Lou drew an image of the tree for the flags to be silk screened before we found the tree. And the tree itself turned into the platonic ideal of itself, because the picture that she drew actually turned out to be the tree, even though there was no way that could have been so beautifully planned. But anyway, this was, I'd like to end, I guess, with the first day after this installation was installed. A woman who teaches nursing emailed Emily Little to say that she had walked the trail and had been so struck by the power of the prayer flags, and that she wondered how this had affected behavior. Was it changing? It was motivation, changing behavior, and that she was going to bring her students down to look at this and to talk about that, because that's what an important part of their training. And she believed that this had had a big impact, and the feedback that we have believed that it did. So let's continue the conversation. This is where the tree came from. It was Lori and Tito Beverage's ranch, and they called it Firewood Ranch because all the trees were dead and dying on the ranch. It's right